I've been doing pretty much the entire month. So we're going to be starting with the wide receivers today. Incredibly true statistics on the wide receivers. Let's do it. So when I was doing this article and video, there was a lot of receivers to choose from. Obviously, we know that wide receiver is the deepest position in the entire league. Teams often have at least two receivers that could be startable in most leagues. So with that, you have a lot more options to choose from. So what I'm going to do is in this article that I wrote, I listed three incredibly true statistics for wide receivers, and then I had some honorable mentions at the end where they didn't necessarily deserve a full breakdown, but we'll talk about that a little bit too. So first up, we're talking about Mike Williams. Unbelievably, Mike Williams is the wide receiver one in Dynasty Owner this year. He's tied with Cooper Kupp. They both have 119.1 fantasy points. Truly amazing start to the season for him. First 5 games. Both of them are on pace. They have 23.8 fantasy points per game. So really unbelievable pace that they're on. It's also impressive is that he went for more than 36 fantasy points in 2 of his 5 games. So he's got that boom potential as well as that stable upside as well. So he leads all wide receivers in the NFL with 6 touchdowns. So he's got that touchdown upside. I expect that to level off as it almost always does. But he's also in the top 5 in yards and targets for wide receivers. Incredibly hot start, like I said. So much potential coming out of college, and I actually put this in my article on the trivia question. So Mike Williams was selected 7th overall in the 2017 NFL draft. He was the second wide receiver selected, though. So do you know who the first was? And I'll put that at the end of my article as well. And we know that Williams has dealt with injuries, especially last season. It was a pretty rough one for him. But I think that we're witnessing the breakout. It took him a little bit longer, a little bit longer to see it than most wide receivers. But, if he can continue to stay healthy for the whole season, I don't think he'll be the wide receiver one at the end of the season. I wouldn't say it's impossible, but I'm not projecting that. But I think he'll be a safe, wide receiver top 10 total at the end of the season. Regardless, he needs to be started for the rest of the season in pretty much every league, I would assume, unless you're, absolutely stacked. Up next, we'll talk about Marquis Brown. So Hollywood Brown had a fantastic game last week. It was Monday Night Football. He comes into week 6 as the wide receiver 6, and he's a player who was given up on a lot, especially last year, towards the beginning of the year, but even in 2019. 2019 and the first half of 2020 just had a very disappointing season, and it's not so much that his play was bad or that, he ended the season bad. It's just that day to day, week to week, he had that inconsistency, wildly inconsistent games. So, for example, let me break it down for you. So in 2020, Marquis had 6 games with less than 10 fantasy points. Not terrible, I guess, but also not great. 5 of those games were in the first half of the season, so it kind of taints your view on him. Especially at the start of the season, people tended to give up on him. But we also see that a similar trend was present in 2019. So Brown had 8 games with less than 10 fantasy points for the total of 2019. Just not going to get done. I mean, that's very disappointing. Half your games are less than 10 points. They're bust games. So in addition to being inconsistent, he also seemed like he never had that boom potential. So in 2020, his highest scoring fantasy output in Dynasty Owner was 21.1 fantasy points. That's good. That's a good game, but when that's your best in the season and you're putting up 6 games of less than 10 fantasy points, that's just not, it's not safe. It's not a safe player. And it's just not a great stat line for a player that busts 38% of the time, at least in 2020. So in the first 5 games of 2021, however, he seems to have broken that trend. 106.6 fantasy points total, 21.3 fantasy points per game. He did have one bust game, 8.3, but the rest have been all over 19 points. So it seems like he's doing this very quietly as well. There's not much buzz around him. So very quietly, he's the wide receiver 6 on the season. He's a top 10 wide receiver in terms of salary. He's making less than $3 million per year. If he keeps that up, he's starting to sound like a value of the year candidate, and there's no reason he shouldn't be. If he finishes top 10 with that salary, he'll be, definitely a candidate for my final, article of the year, values of the year. And up next, maybe the biggest shock, at least for me, for how early he did it, is Jamar Chase. So Chase makes right at $7.5 million. He's the wide receiver 8 through 5 games this season. 98.4 fantasy points per game. That's almost 20 points per game. 98.4 fantasy points total, and then that's almost 20 fantasy points per game. So I'll be the first to admit I did not see this coming. I don't think I drafted Chase in any league that I'm in, redraft, dynasty owner league. I don't have Chase in any of them. Not necessarily that I was down on him as a player. It's just he's a rookie. His average draft position was a little bit high for me. In redraft leagues, he was going around fourth or fifth round. It's a little too steep for me. And then in dynasty owner leagues, he was going, I think he was most of the time the first wide receiver off the board, that third, fourth, fifth, sixth pick. Just too early for me. But, if you drafted him at that position, you're getting great value out of it now. Good for you if you did that, if you continue to own him. Of all the wide receivers with 20 more catches, Chase ranks first in yards per reception at 19.8. So big plays have certainly been there for him. Of his 5 touchdowns, 4 of them were long distance. So 4 were over 30 yards, 2 of them were over 50 yards, and 1 was a 70-yard touchdown. So big plays. Big plays have been there for Chase this year. And then the last thing I want to do is I wanted to compare Justin Jefferson to Chase, just because, we had Jefferson's historic season last year. So let's look at how they both did through their first 5 games of their career. And you can go to my article to see all the stats, but I'll break it down for you real quick. Chase has 4 more receptions so far. He's got right at 80 yards more, and he's got 4 more touchdowns than Jefferson did at this point in his career. Jefferson had a little bit of a slow start for how he finished, but fantasy points, Chase has about 36 more fantasy points than Jefferson did at the same time last year. It's easy to see. Chase has been much better his first 5 NFL games. Doesn't really tell you a whole lot, right? I mean, kind of fluky, but if he can keep this up for the rest of the season, which I don't know if he can, but if he can, this is going to be truly one of the most historic wide receiver, maybe the most historic wide receiver season we've ever seen. So let's compare that. We look at Justin Jefferson's entire 2020 season. He had 88 receptions, 1,400 yards, 7 touchdowns. Good for 273 fantasy points. Jamar Chase is on pace, and now I did this for a 16-game season just because I didn't want to be comparing 16 to 17 games. So Jamar Chase, through the 16-game season, he's on pace for 78 receptions, a little bit down from Jefferson, 1,459 yards, and 16 touchdowns. That's good for 314.9 fantasy points. I don't project that, especially the touchdowns. I don't think he's going to finish with 16 touchdowns on the season. But if he does, if he keeps his pace up, it's going to be the best wide receiver season we've ever seen. Like I said, not projecting that, but sometimes it's fun to stat it out and see exactly how it would shake up. It's fun to ask what if, what if he continues his pace. So that's it for the players I want to talk about. The honorable mentions for the players that I'm a little surprised about, incredibly where they're at. So Deebo Samuel is wide receiver 5 right now in Dynasty Owner. That's definitely incredible for where he was being drafted, especially with his salary, $1.8 million. Very generous spot for him to be at with his salary. DeAndre Hopkins, on the bad side, Hopkins is wide receiver 16. Not necessarily that that's bad, but when you're paying $27 million for a wide receiver, you kind of need him to be in that top 10, top 8 range at least to get that value. So it's been a disappointing season so far for Hopkins. And then likely just as disappointing as Stefan Diggs. So he's wide receiver 27 right now, making $14.4 million a year. Disappointing. I expect both of them to pick it up. They'll both probably finish as top 10 wide receivers, so I'm not too worried about it. But that salary right now, when they're struggling a little bit, is definitely hurting you. That's all I want to talk about today. I appreciate everybody watching the video. Go ahead and read the article if you haven't already, and I will see you next week.